She moved into the shack no one wanted. The roof drooped like an old eyebrow over a crooked door, and the path up the hill was a ribbon of red dust that turned to mud when it rained. From the village below, people watched her climb that slope with a single suitcase and a tiredness that seemed to belong to someone twice her age. They said little. Gossip, in that place, was the slow work of afternoons. It took root and grew without anyone ever intending it. Some called the shack unlucky. Others said it had been empty for years and held nothing but rot and memories. Still she climbed, and the wind that tossed at her hair seemed to whisper a kind of permission. Her name was Mara. She arrived at dusk, when the light was thin and forgiving. The last rays of sun caught the broken panes and threw them back in crooked shards. She pushed the door with a shoulder. It groaned, and a smell rose up. Old wood, a hint of mothballs, the faint, stubborn scent of lemon soap. She stepped inside like a person stepping into prayer, quietly, with hands folded in thought and a small, precise hope tucked under her ribs. The first nights were not dramatic. They were long and steady, a practice of patience. Mara found a broom in the corner and a box of faded matches under the sink. She learned to coax a living light from a candle, strike, breath, cup the flame like something holy and small. By candlelight, her hands became translators of the house's language, scrubbing away years of dust, moving a sagging chair so the floor could breathe, clearing a shelf until wood grain showed like a smile. Outside, the village murmured. Some people avoided the path entirely, choosing longer routes and quieter gossip. Children pointed for a while, then got bored and forgot. A neighbor who sold eggs dropped a carton over the low fence one morning and left without lingering, as if passing a small offering could make things easier for both of them. There were glances of suspicion, too. An old man who had once lived near the shack crossed himself when he noticed Mara in the doorway and told other men at the market to be careful. No one wanted to be the first to say what the house might mean. Better to keep fear as rumor than risk the discomfort of confronting emptiness. Mara accepted the eggs and set them on the table. She boiled a pot over a small burner and listened to the water talk. She prayed in small, honest sentences that at first felt embarrassingly bare. Lord, she would say, if this is where you want me, help me to see it as you see it. Help me to stay when it's hard. Give me courage to do what must be done. Her prayers were not argument or bargaining. They were a steady kind of asking, an opening of hands. On the third morning, she found something that shifted the shape of her solitude. It happened while she was pulling up a loose board behind the stove. A snag of cloth caught on a nail. Beneath the plank, wrapped in oilcloth that had long since bled into the color of the wood, was a photograph. The edges had curled. The ink had mellowed to a sepia that made everything look kinder than it had been. In the picture, a small family sat on the very doorstep Mara now scrubbed. A woman with a wide, patient smile, a man with hands tucked on his knees, and a child with two braids that framed a face like a promise. On the back, someone had written in a hurried hand, "For the next ones who come, this was ours, and it taught us to love." Mara's fingers traced the thin script. The words landed in her like rain. They did not erase the shabbiness of the room or the weight of the gossip, but they opened a corridor into the past, a past where this place had been inhabited not by fear but by care. She sat on the floor with the photo on her palms and felt for the first time a kinship with the house. It was as if the walls themselves had been waiting for someone to remember them correctly. Word traveled, as such things did. Stories prefer to walk, not fly. The photograph became, for a few, a curiosity that softened some faces. A woman at the market who had once delivered bread to the household remembered them, how the family had kept a small table for anyone passing by. She hummed an old tune and pressed a loaf into Mara's hands, the same kind of gesture the world sometimes uses to say, "We will try with you." Not everyone softened. There were those who claimed it was dangerous to keep the shack open to strangers. Better to board it up and let it be, they said. But among the village's cautions there were also small acts of mercy. An old blanket left over a wall, a jar of coffee placed carefully on the windowsill, a note slipped under the door. If you need help, knock at dawn. Mara answered each kindness quietly. She nailed a strip of cloth to the windows to keep the drafts out, arranged the loaves on the simplest plate she had, and when children came to peek, she offered them a crumb and a smile. She wrote a short list each night: sweep the floor, mend the curtain, check the water jug. On the margins of the page, she began to write prayers, small, stitched petitions that she read before sleep. Lord, thank you for the photograph. Help me to be worthy of what it suggests. It was not pride, but a humble hope that she might live into the kindness that had once been threaded through the house. The house yielded more secrets in time, but nothing came all at once. There was a rhythm like file work, small revelations stacked into meaning. Beneath a loose stair, she found a letter, folded carefully, as if the writer had believed that paper kept secrets as well as names. The ink had faded, the edges of the page gave at the touch. The letter was addressed to someone named Hannah. Hannah was the woman in the photograph. Though Mara did not yet give the idea a name, she simply read. "My dear," the letter began, "if the road has led you back to this place, may you be brave with the same gentleness we tried to practice here. There is no wealth in these walls, only room. We learned that to feed one is to feed 1,000, because love multiplies in this place as if by its very architecture." There was a small sketch at the bottom, a crude drawing of a table with many chairs, and the last line read, "Keep a candle for those who come hungry for more than bread." Mara folded the letter and held it to her chest. "Keep a candle for those who come hungry." She said the phrase aloud and felt it seed something inside her. It almost sounded like a calling, not to a career or to fame, but to a way of living, simple, stubborn, and hospitable. She began to think less about whether the villagers thought the shack cursed and more about what it could become, if tended. A diary came next, tucked behind the false back of a cupboard, its pages full of the ordinary miracles of a life poured outward. Recipes saved from neighbors, names and dates of births and small funerals, lists of people who had slept on the floor when the rain had come. The diary's voice was patient and unassuming. It tracked storms, it recorded who had lent sugar, and who had cried after the funeral of a stranger they had taken in. It was not a chronicle of glory, it was the daybook of people finding each other when no one else would. Mara read each entry as if the writer were handing her a pair of old shoes that would fit if she cared for them. One page stood out. It was scrawled and hurried, the ink blotting with something that might have been tears. "We did not do great things," the entry said. "We did small, stubborn kindnesses. We learned to forgive on the steps because there was no room indoors for grudges. If that is a prayer, then our prayer was answered in crumbs and blankets, and in the way the neighbor with the sour laugh began to come every Thursday to help." Mara closed the diary and let those sentences settle like a lamp. Small signs followed that could be read as coincidence or as the hand of Providence, depending on the eye. A bundle of blankets appeared on her doorstep one morning without a name attached. A man she had never seen put a basket with onions and a little note, "For the woman who came to hold this place." When she asked around, people shrugged. No one would admit to being the messenger. A child from the village left a jar of marbles on the second rung of her porch and wrote in crayon, "For the baby who will sleep here someday." Mara laughed then, a soft, surprised sound. The laugh was not hers entirely. It belonged also to the house, as if it had not been able to hold in its own astonishment. As the days passed, more people arrived at the hilltop in various small ways. They did not always enter. Sometimes they sent a loaf, sometimes a note, sometimes a memory. But word traveled of the small hearth that had begun to be lit again, and with word came those who needed a bench, a bowl, a listening ear. A woman named Pilar, who had fled a difficult marriage, showed up with a duffel and a wide-eyed hope that made Mara's hands clench with both fear and compassion. Pilar was quiet at first, but she mended in the way of someone who had been taught to repair more than fabric. She learned to preserve the little routines Mara set: water fetched at dawn, a kettle kept on steady simmer, blankets folded on a shelf. A boy with 2 missing teeth, Rico, began to sit on the back step and talk about the sky as if it were a vast and kind parent. An elderly man who smelled of smoke and old cigarettes began to come by with stories that were sometimes too sharp and sometimes tender. He brought a battered harmonica and played the few notes he knew whenever Mara was out front arranging flowers she'd found at the roadside. The shack was not a hospital or a shelter in any formal sense. It was a place where people who had drifted off the map for any reason, loss, shame, poverty, found a small harbor. There were also resistances. A council of neighbors convened at the cafe and debated quietly whether such a place would attract trouble. They used the language of public goods and property values the way people use formal phrases to hide their real fears. Mara, when she learned of the meeting, did not go. She cleaned a pan and hummed under her breath. Her posture in those days was mostly that of someone learning to stand. She began to keep a guest book on the table, a simple ledger where people left their names or doodles or short sentences about what had happened to them. The first entry was a scrawl from Pilar: "Found shelter here. Thank you." Another entry in a careful hand read, "Came for a cold bowl. Stayed for a story." A few pages in, someone had left a drawing of the house with hearts in the windows, and beneath it a line in a small child's hand: "This house makes my stomach not hurt when storms come." There came a night when the village's fears crested into open scorn. Someone had seen a stray dog enter the shack and came to report that strange things were happening there, as if a stray could become a story of witchcraft for the right listeners. A rumor bubbled into existence. The place was a magnet for trouble. A woman who had once been kind to Mara avoided her at the market, clutching a basket as if to shield herself from infection. Mara felt the edge of loneliness like a chill under her skin. She also felt something else growing inside her, not defiance exactly, but a steadying conviction. If the house held a memory of love, then it was her responsibility to let that memory breathe again. The decision was not heroic. There was no dramatic revelation on the hill, but a series of small refusals. She refused to close the door. She refused to hoard space. She kept the candle on the table even when she had only a single match left. On a morning of slow rain, a girl with braids and an old face, no more than 12, but with careful brows, came to the door carrying a tin cup of soup that still smelled faintly of bay leaves. She had been watching, the child later said, and could not sleep knowing the house might be cold. The child's name was Lila. Her eyes were curious in the way of one who had learned early that curiosity is safer than resentment. Lila sat on the floor and asked a long string of questions about the pages Mara had found. Who wrote that? Why did they leave? What does keep a candle mean? Mara did not have easy answers. She told Lila what she could, that a family had once chosen this place to be open, that people in need had always found their way there, that she hoped to keep the door ajar for whoever knocked. Lila listened and then, with the unself-conscious kindness of a child, offered to braid more candles by rolling scraps of wax in old cloth, a playful solution that made them both laugh. It was a small moment, nearly invisible, but minutes like that stacked into confidence. As the months moved on, the house became less of an outcast and more like a question the village had to answer. Neighbors brought useful things: a rickety cot, a pot big enough to cook for 10, a kerosene lamp that burned clean. An elderly woman who had once been the midwife in the valley came down the lane one afternoon and laid a hand on Mara's shoulder. "You remember how to sit with people," she said. The sentence was as light as a hand on a back, but it steadied Mara in the way a single word may steady a drifting boat. The small acts of kindness multiplied in quiet and credible ways. A tinsmith fixed the leaking faucet for a plate of food. A teacher offered to bring children's books and sit and read under the lamp. No one announced a miracle with a headline or a trumpet. Miracles here were practical: food that kept coming, hands that returned to help without claiming reward, voices that listened. That was how the shack was reborn, through the daily logistics of care: beds that were cleared, bowls that were washed, blankets aired and refolded. Mara kept the diary and tended to the ledger. She began to leave a small note pinned to the bulletin board by the entrance: "We have room for one more today. If you need warmth, come." She did not know how many would take the offer. Sometimes 3 or 4 showed up, sometimes none. Once a young expectant mother, pale from the road and shaking with cold, arrived at twilight, and the small cluster that had gathered, Mara, the midwife, Lila, made a bed and a meal, and lit the stubborn, watchful candle. Pilar stayed all night and hummed a song she had learned from another house on another hill. By morning, the woman's lips had color again, and the village had another story to tell, one about a baby saved from the cold by a ragtag team of helpers who refused to judge her. Still, not all problems could be soothed by bread and blankets. There were wounds that took longer to heal, words that had scarred a person's sense of self, betrayals that had hollowed out trust. Mara learned, clumsily and faithfully, that hospitality sometimes meant sitting with silence that did not need to be filled, or lending a hand without rushing to fix. She learned to hold space for anger and grief, and to offer the quiet of a listening ear. Sometimes she prayed out loud in short sentences, because words can make a room breathe. "Lord, give her rest. Lord, help him forgive. Lord, steady hands tonight." And then there came a season of weather that tested the little network Mara had begun to build. The sky, which had often been accommodating, grew brooding and heavy. Clouds swelled like the bellies of ships on the horizon. The river that ran down past the village rose slow and stubborn, and the old men at the cafe began to talk about harvests and the land as if the weather were a living creature they were trying to persuade. There was no panic. The village had seen storms before. Yet there was an edge of anxiety, a sense that something was coming that would make people show what they were made of. Mara felt it too. She stood on the porch one evening with Lila at her side, watching the first ribs of rain fan across the red dirt road. The wind carried a smell of distant thunder and the soft metallic scent of wet iron. The night was a study in close things: the creak of the front step, the way the candle flame shivered like a small animal, the hush as even the sparrows hid their heads. Lila traced a circle on the kitchen table with the tip of her finger and did not speak. The house held its breath. That night, before sleep, Mara went through her small litany of things to do: shut the windows, check the jars, fold the spare blankets. She stood a long time with the photograph in her hand, looking at the faces that had once been footed in this doorway. She pressed the paper to her lips. "Lord," she whispered, "if this is where you want me, help me keep it for whoever comes. Help me not to be afraid. Let me recognize when you come, even in odd places." It was not a demand, it was the handing over of a small, trembling trust. The air tightened, as if the world had pulled a curtain close. The first drops of rain were not alarming, they were simply the beginning of a sentence. But then the storm gathered words. Thunder rolled low and deliberate. The sky opened in long sheets. and the path up the hill turned to a ribbon of red clay that clung to boots like apology. The wind beat at the eaves, and the candle inside fought to keep its light. The hush split into the noise of weather. As the rain came, so did the consequences of choosing to live in a place no one wanted. The villagers, tempted by old fears, wondered if the house should be closed for safety. Someone muttered that keeping people there in such weather might be reckless. Mara, who had no right to force anyone's trust, set chairs against the doors and made sure no one slept with their heads under a roof of loose tiles. She checked the pots. She made a slow circuit of the rooms like a careful animal. Outside, water threaded through the land in new paths. Inside, the people who had found refuge in the shack, those who lived there on that night, gathered under the steadying glare of the lamp. It was then, while the rain hammered like hands on the roof, that the world narrowed to the thin pulse of a single human need: shelter, ready hands, someone to say, "I will be with you." In the cramped warmth of the room, Mara felt something shift, an interior quiet so deep it had shape. It was not the answer she expected, no thunderous voice, no display. It was a stillness that folded the edges of fear back and let breath return to the chest. For a moment, the storm was outside, and a different world sat inside the house, a small, luminous hush like a room cleared of chairs. Mara put her hand over her chest and felt a peace that was not her own. She did not see a vision. She did not hear words blare from the sky. Instead, she felt a certain rightness settle in her bones, as if a long closed door inside her had been pushed open by a gentle, invisible hand. In the hush came a sentence that seemed less like a spoken thing and more like memory aligning with reality. "This is where you are to be. You will not be alone." Mara's eyes filled in a way that was all at once tender and terrifying, the soft kind of fear that recognizes a charge. She whispered, "Lord, I will stay. Use this place for what you will." She did not demand proof. She asked for capacity. When the storm eased at dawn, the world smelled washed. The red dirt had been beaten flat into patterns of rivulets. The village came awake with the tired business of repair. People came down to the river to see whether fences had held, whether boats needed mending. And on the porch of the shack, where the rain had left neat circles of tired water, there was a basket tied with a faded ribbon. No name was on it. Inside were loaves wrapped in cloth, a handful of onions, a bundle of clean towels, and a small envelope. The envelope held a single slip of paper. "Keep the candle." No signature. Mara stood in the doorway and looked at the basket. It could have been coincidence, one person giving to another in a community that had learned to help. She did not need it to be more than that. But she could not help the rising tide of gratitude that felt like a quiet answer to her prayer. She shelled peas on the kitchen table with hands that moved steady and slow, noting the ordinary geometry of tenderness. Someone thought of others and acted. That thought had consequences. Around the village, murmurs softened. The old men who had once warned against the shack now passed more slowly along the road, striking up abrupt, uneasy conversations that ended with a pat on the shoulder for Mara when they saw her. The midwife started to bring herbs in jars. Leela's mother stopped by with a bowl and said, more honestly than she had spoken in weeks, "I was wrong to be afraid." It was not a triumphal victory. It was the lean, awkward work of people learning to trust one another again. Mara wrote in the ledger that afternoon. She recorded the visitors, the supplies, the names of those who had slept there that night. On the margin, she wrote a small, shaky sentence. Someone left a basket. Keep the candle. Under that, she drew a tiny flame and circled it. It felt like a beginning that had to be treated as a responsibility rather than a miracle. She placed the basket on the table and set the loaves on a rack. Twice that day people came by asking whether they could sit for a while.
one for a bowl, another for a place to nap their aching bones. The house, which had once been a rumor of danger, was slowly becoming a station of relief. Yet questions remained, like stones in a pocket. Who left the basket? Why did some still pause at the gate with skepticism etched into their faces? Was this merely the human kindness of a few, or something deeper making itself known? Mara did not have answers in clear bottles. She had instead a string of small proofs, a photograph, a letter, a diary, an envelope with a ribbon, that together made the shape of a mission she had not expected to own. The season advanced. The village settled into a cautious rhythm around the hill. Children began to come without asking, bringing drawings and impulsive cups of bright underbrewed tea. The midwife's visits became regular. Leela learned where to keep the matches and which page of the diary had the best recipes for recovering from sleepless nights. Mara began to think of the house as a place that could hold not only bodies, but stories. Griefs that needed to be told and witness notes to be kept. She began to ask people to write short cards when they left, to preserve the shape of the night's events for someone who might read them later and say, "This is true." Then, one afternoon, a battered black car pulled up at the base of the hill, a vehicle that no one had seen in weeks. A man in a plain coat climbed down with a box of cans, closed the trunk, and walked up the path with the careful gait of someone who had learned to keep secrets in his hands. He did not look like a pastor or a benefactor. He had the blank look of someone who had chosen anonymity. Mara met him at the gate. He placed the box on her stoop, nodded, and said only, "We heard you needed help." There was no trumpet in his voice. He looked like one more neighbor, except that his eyes carried a steady warmth that cut through suspicion. That evening, as the son made a slow apology for leaving, Mara sat with the photograph and the diary spread on the table. People were cooking in the small kitchen. The house smelled of onions and citrus peel.
Leela was asleep on the cot, and Pilar hummed under her breath, knitting something that might become a child's hat. The village outside moved like a creature that had begun to relearn itself. Mara thought of the first night she had climbed the hill with only a suitcase and a hope that was more survival than conviction. She thought of the photograph's smiling family, of the letter that had told her to keep a candle for those who came hungry, and of the basket left at her door in the dawn after the storm. She felt tired in the honest way of someone who has chosen a difficult road. But knotted into that fatigue was a kind of gratitude that made her chest ache with sweetness. She stood and walked to the window. The road below gleamed with wet red clay, reflecting a pale new-found light. The village lights, the lamplight from the cafe, the house lights tucked like little promises. For a flicker of time, Mara allowed herself to imagine what this place could be. A map of small rescues. A woman giving shelter to a mother. A child learning to trust an adult. An old man finding a voice again. And that imagination filled the house with a peculiar warmth. Outside, a wind began to move the trees in a way that said weather was changing again. The air had the slow sharpness that sometimes precedes a storm, so earnest it cannot be ignored. Mara breathed deeply and repeated softly, "Lord, let me be faithful in what I am given." She folded her hands and felt the weight of a future that was not yet written, but that leaned toward keeping the flame alive. The wind rose, and far off on the road the silhouette of someone walking came into view, bent by fatigue but moving with a stubborn rhythm. Mara could not see the face clearly. She only knew that another journey had begun, someone else choosing to walk toward the place no one wanted. The house seemed to lean forward in expectation, and Mara's mouth shaped a small, steady prayer. She did not know then how the next nights would test the fragile network she had built, nor how the photograph and the diary would become the anchors of a ministry that would surprise the village itself. She only knew, in a way that was both terrifying and luminous, that living into the habit of hospitality can make one a steward of more than rooms and meals. It can make one the custodian of a legacy that refuses to die.
Outside, the first distant grumble of thunder rolled, and Mara went to light the candle on the table, cupped her hands around the flame, and whispered, "Lord, whatever comes, let this house be for shelter, for song, for healing. Let me hold what I have been given." The flame did not flare, it did not speak, but it kept burning. If this speaks to you, comment, "I believe." The storm that followed felt like a story closing in on itself. For 2 nights, the rain thudded without mercy, and the hill up which Mara had walked with a single suitcase became a riverbed for mud and small impatient currents. The lamp inside the shack burned steady, a stubborn coin of warmth in the long hours. Leela slept on the cot with her knees tucked. Pilar kept a pot simmering and hummed a low sewing song. Rico and the old harmonica man had found places by the stove. Even the midwife, who rarely wore sentiment like a cloak, sat with her hands folded and watched the curtain of water as if watching a test. In the hush that follows incessant rain, people listen for small things to be true. A floorboard that held up, a door that stayed shut, a child's breath that came evenly in the night. Mara moved through the rooms like a careful animal. She thumbed the candle wick, checked the jugs, made sure the single leaky pane of glass did not let in a fresh flood. When the wind rose and the lamp flame bent, Mara cupped it with both hands as she had the first month. Again an act of faith. Again a tiny prayer. "Lord, keep us. Lord, teach my hands." She did not ask for headlines or signs. She asked for what the house could hold. At dawn, the village came down to look. People came not in crowds, but in the loose stitches of neighbors, checking fences, trading news, asking about roofs. Some crossed themselves quietly when they saw the shack still standing and the little knot of people on its porch. A boy from the far end of the lane threw pebbles at a tin roof in the distance, like an attempt to test courage. The man who had left the anonymous basket the morning after the first storm, someone had said they'd seen him in the road, a figure in a plain coat, was there again, though he kept his distance. He placed another box, this time of rice and sugar, by the gate and left without a word. Mara opened the lid with a slow, grateful breath and felt again the odd, tender conviction that the place was not really alone. Word reached Mara's ears that the Council of Neighbors had debated, again, about the shack. Practical voices, someone who ran the hardware store, someone who kept accounts for the co-op, spoke of liability and of the cost of keeping an unsanctioned shelter. The voice of the midwife, who had seen more life than most, argued in other terms. This was not about paperwork, but about bodies and need. The debate folded into the regular life of the village like a seam. It existed whether anyone looked at it closely or not. Mara learned of it secondhand, through a plate left on the windowsill and a hesitant thumbs up from the tinsmith as he walked past. What kept the shelter from collapsing under the weight of debate was not a formal plan. It was testimony that arrived one small note at a time. A folded piece of paper appeared in the guest book where, some nights before, someone had drawn hearts in the window. This note was from a man who had come 2 months earlier. A man whose daughter had slept on the floor of the shack after being turned away by her employer. He wrote, "My girl came back to work. She is still fragile, but she smiles sideways now. She learned to trust a bowl of soup."
Thank you. Another card, written by a woman who had been sober 3 weeks more than a year ago, said simply, "They gave me a kitchen where I could cook without shame. I left my old bottle on the step." It is a small ledger of ordinary miracles. People recovered dignity by being given a place to fail and be mended. The practical tests continued. A man in a business jacket showed up one morning with an offer. He would fund repairs to the shack, tiles, a proper door, a cement threshold. But in return, he wanted plaques, recognition, something that would turn the story into a public venture. His name was Luis, and he spoke politely about grants and tourism, the sort of language that dresses giving in a suit. Mara listened and thanked him for his generosity. The midwife watched the exchange with a narrow face. Pilar frowned. There was a temptation to accept the security such an offer would buy. Mara could see, with an aching clarity, what a sound roof and a solid door might mean for the nights ahead. But she also felt the edges of a promise the photograph had carried. Keep a candle for those who come hungry for more than bread. Money could buy materials. It could not buy the particular courage it takes to keep the door ajar for the shameful, the messy, the unpresentable ones. Mara folded her hands and spoke in the way she had learned when decisions mattered. Lord, let me give what is needed without losing what keeps it holy. She did not say the words of negotiation to Luis. She simply asked for discernment. In the end, she proposed a middle way. Repairs paid, but no plaques, no spectacle, and any support would be anonymous if requested. Luis hesitated. He wanted a story to tell, but he also wanted to be useful. In the slow arithmetic of village life, his first meeting with Mara became the seed of a compromise that preserved the shelter's privacy and bought a window that would not leak. As repairs took shape, new tiles, a patched roof, a door with a modest brass knob, so did a roster of helpers in small shapes. There was no donor dinner or public ribbon cutting. There were men who fixed the threshold for a plate, women who taught Leela and other children how to stitch, and a retired teacher who brought books with dog-eared corners. The rhythm of assistance felt like the stitching of a quilt. Many hands, none claiming the whole. The shack itself did not become a palace. It became a place where the weather could be kept at bay, and where dignity was kept in stock. Alongside the practical work came stories of restoration, short, stinging, and honest. A man named Tomas, who had come to the shack with a mouth full of bitterness and a jaw set against the world, found a place to sit and tell his story. Years before, he had been an angry man. A factory closure, a son who left and did not come back, loud nights at the tavern. At the shack, he learned to chop wood for the stove, and to carry water without curses under his breath. The rhythm of assistance felt like the stitching of a quilt. Many hands, none claiming the whole. The shack itself did not become a palace. It became a place where the weather could be kept at bay, and where dignity was kept in stock. Alongside the practical work came stories of restoration, short, stinging, and honest. A man named Tomas, who had come to the shack with a mouth full of bitterness and a jaw set against the world, found a place to sit and tell his story. Years before, he had been an angry man. A factory closure, a son who left and did not come back, loud nights at the tavern. At the shack, he learned to chop wood for the stove and to carry water without curses under his breath. One evening, he left a note in the guest book that read, "I carried 10 logs today and meant every one. I said sorry to the boy next door. I did not know I could do that." The smallness of his sentence belied how much had shifted. The shack offered him not a tribunal, but chores and listening, and in the chores, practice. A young woman named Camilla arrived on a train of rumors that softened when she stood in the doorway and let people see a body that had been bruised both by hands and by life. She had run from a man who had kept asking for apologies for wrongs that were not hers. In the weeks that followed, she learned to cook the simple stew in the diary's recipe. She left a note one night that read, "Someone kissed my forehead when I cried and did not ask me to move on." That sentence, scratched in a hurried hand, was testimony of the kind of restoration the house offered, presence without pressure. Not every story was of recovery quickly won. There were setbacks, arguments over a borrowed sweater that did not come back, someone who left in the night to return to old patterns, a child who accused Lila of taking a toy when Lila had simply set it aside to clean. Mara learned to steward both joy and rupture, to say quick apologies, to insist on talk when tempers rose, and to keep the ledger updated with names and dates so the narrative of the place would be true over time. As months braided into a year, the shack's ledger grew fat with details. Names, meals, small drawings, thank-you notes folded like flowers.
The diary that had been found under the cupboard now lay open on Mara's table sometimes, and she would read passages aloud to those who wanted to hear. We learned to forgive on the steps because there was no room indoors for grudges. The words, when spoken, had the effect of a confessed creed, not theology, but practice. Live together, feed each other, let grudges be aired before the candle is put down. Those lines became the house's unofficial liturgy. One autumn morning, a woman arrived clutching a piece of paper like a lifeline. Her name was Rosa, and the paper was a letter from a relative who had died and left her without a place to stay. She was elderly and fragile, with hands like thin maps. The midwife took one look and set a teapot to warm. The jolt of practical charity that followed, blankets, someone to help wash, a neighbor bringing chicken, reminded everyone that the house's ministry was not only for the young or the dramatic. It was for the quiet, slow erosion of a life that needed tending. Rosa left a card in the guest book 3 weeks later. I learned to make tea again. I slept without being afraid. The admission read like a small miracle. As local testimonies multiplied, the village's suspicion softened into a protective curiosity. Children no longer pointed as if to prove scorn. Instead, they left marbles and small drawings.
The tinsmith, who had once feared for property values, began to insist, to anyone who would listen, that the shack had saved him from the loneliness he did not know he had. The midwife, who had presided over births and deaths and kept the ledger of both, called the place a necessary margin, space outside the tidy order where the messy human things could be set right. It was during this season of quiet fruit that a visitor came who changed the rhythm of the place not by money but by a simple act of seeing. He walked up the hill one bright afternoon carrying nothing but a satchel and a small wooden flute. He looked like a man who had walked many roads and had chosen to keep his burden small. Mara found him sitting on the threshold as if he had always been expected. He asked no big questions. He placed his hands on the table, ran his fingers across the diary's spine, and said quietly, "This is a strange and holy job you are doing." He introduced himself as Elias, though no one required that name to be true. He listened to stories all afternoon and later helped whatever needed fixing in the kitchen with the patient care of someone who knew how to mend more than utensils. Elias's presence was a gentle provocation. He suggested small systems, a way to record needs and offer help across the village, a roster so that the midwife would not burn out, a visiting hour for those who could not stay the night but wanted a meal. No grand architecture, only thoughtful logistics. The men and women who came by began to see their help as a rotation, not a heroic rescue. In this way, the shack became less of a singular responsibility on Mara's shoulders and more of a village practice, distributed, awkwardly perfect. As the shelter needed less of Mara's muscle and more of her soul, she found other parts of herself returning. There were days when she could sit and write in the diary with a steadier hand, days when she could laugh in full rather than in apology. Pilar took to planting a herb garden in a battered pot because plants are stubbornly hopeful. The midwife taught Leela how to boil a medicinal tea. Mara began to dream also. Dreams punctuated by the photograph's smiling family. Dreams in which the table in the drawing was real and had more chairs than she could count. These dreams were not fantasies of fame, they were small blueprints of community, a place where children could come in from storms and find stories to listen to. Years, measured in the quick arithmetic of births and funerals and guestbook entries, marked a change. Rico's missing teeth gave place to a mouth that laughed. Tomas opened a small stall where he sold woodcraft he had learned to make steady-handed. Rosa taught children to pour tea without spilling. The ledger that Mara kept, now thicker than it had any right to be, was a map of human repair. Visitors left notes in the margins of the diary, some of them scribbled prayers. "Lord, give her strength. Thank you for this table." That the words were honest and small was the miracle. Not some thunderous overturning, but the steady accumulation of care.
The day came when Mara sat alone at the table, under light that smelled faintly of lemon soap and candle smoke. She skimmed an old page in the diary that read, "We did small, stubborn kindnesses. We learned to forgive on the steps." A softness came to her chest, a feeling like a hand laid there. She had begun her work as a refuge for those who had been shoved to the margins. She had become a keeper of stories, and an unwilling heir to a legacy she had not chosen, yet now embraced. It was on such a quiet evening, with the village slung low in the valley and lights like cautious stars, that the man with simple robes came. He was no grand figure. He walked with the surety of someone who had sat in many kitchens and listened to many confessions. He carried nothing but a small satchel and wore a coat frayed at the cuffs. Mara saw him first as a silhouette against the last of the light. He halted on the path and looked, as everyone had looked when approaching the door, for permission. Mara rose without fuss and opened it. He spoke in a voice that was neither old nor young, simply steady. "May I sit?" he asked. "Of course," Mara replied. Her voice did not quaver. She had learned to be calm in the presence of need. The man entered and set his satchel down. He smelled faintly of earth and rain. He sat by the table where the photograph lay, and his fingers rested for a while on the diary's spine, as if he recognized what it held. They spoke, at first, about small things: the weather, the state of the road, the midwife's long arms. Then, like the patient remove of a bandage, the conversation peeled into deeper places. Mara told him what the house had been: a rumor, a shelter, a ledger of quiet acts. He listened without interruption, and in his listening there was a tone that made Mara feel seen rather than judged. There was no sermon, only attention. At some point the man asked a question that had nothing to do with plans or grants. "When you light the candle, what are you hoping for?" he said. Mara blinked. She thought of the photograph's note, the letter's crooked exhortation, the diary's patient record. She thought of Leela braiding candle scraps with a childlike solemnness, of Pilar humming as she knitted, of the basket on the porch after the storm. She thought of the night when the storm had folded the world into fear and given her a strange, quiet peace. Her voice then was a simple litany. "I'm hoping to keep a place for those the world has misplaced. I'm hoping to do the small thing again tomorrow. I'm asking for courage." He nodded, and for a moment his expression was almost like the shadow of a smile. He reached toward the photograph and ran a finger over the curled edge, as if acknowledging the family who had once kept custody of the house's soul.
Then he looked directly at Mara and said quietly, with a weight that made the kitchen's light feel like some delicate altar, "You have kept the candle." Mara felt the phrase like a hand in her chest. "You have kept the candle." It was both quiet and colossal. The man did not arise with a trumpet or a psalm. He did not demand the circle of witnesses to stand and testify. He sat, ordinary, and in that ordinary sitting, his presence completed something for Mara that had been unfinished, an affirmation that the small, stubborn work of hospitality had been seen by one who noticed such things. "Lord," Mara breathed, because prayer was the frame she spoke within even when words were not explicitly offered to heaven. "Lord, I have tried to be faithful." He did not correct her theology or offer a new doctrine. He simply said in a voice that was softened by something beyond mere kindness, "Well done." The phrase landed like the oldest form of approval, not theatrical, not trumpeted, but intimate and full. Tears came to Mara's eyes, not staged or easy, but slow and honest. "Thank you," she whispered, not fully certain to whom she spoke. Those who were present, Leela, Pilar, the midwife, a man from the village who had come to fix a leaky pipe and was now sitting with his chin cupped in his hands, felt, in a way that does not obey strict explanation, a settling.
It was as if a long argument about worth and place had quietly resolved in the room. Some would later say they had seen no angel, no bright flash. Others would say they had felt a hand on their shoulder that was not another's. The truth was small and layered. A man in simple robes speaking an ancient word of regard, and hearts that had been tentative finding permission to beat without apology. Mara later wrote in the ledger, "He sat at the table and said, 'You have kept the candle.'" Underneath, she drew a little flame and circled it with a hand that trembled. She did not write the man's name. Some things in the village he preferred to keep between himself and the diary's paper. After that evening, the shelter's work did not turn miraculous in the sense of headlines. It became something steadier. People continued to come with needs and leave with stories. There were still nights of rain and mornings when the tin roof sang with leaks. There were still arguments that needed cooling and tempers that frayed. But the place no longer bore the burden of being evidence of improper choices. It bore a different weight, that of a trust openly accepted. Years later, when Mara walked the hill and paused at the gate, children would race past her, marbles clattering, and call out plans for new stories. Old men would nod and say the shack had saved them from loneliness. Young mothers would bring newborns to rest on blankets set out in the yard. Someone would always find a new jar of marbles on a shelf, a folded sweater, a note that read simply, "We were fed here, thank you." The house had become, in the way that small things sometimes become large, an unlikely cathedral, a place where meals and listening were the sacraments. Mara grew older in the service of that calling. Her hair threaded with silver, her hands marked with the lines of work, she learned to step back and let others cook. She watched Leela, now taller and steady, braid candles and instruct newcomers on how to sign the guest book. She watched Pilar open her hands to other women with the same careful ferocity she had once reserved for the house. The legacy was not sinless, nor perfect. It was real and tender and often messy, but it was faithful. On an ordinary afternoon when the sun turned the red clay to copper, a letter arrived without a return address. It was addressed to the shelter and had on its first page the simplest line, "For the next ones who come, thank you for keeping the flame." The handwriting looked a little like the script on the photograph's back. Mara placed the letter beside the diary and felt the years fold together. The family who had once lived here, the anonymous baskets, the man in the plain coat, Elias who had mended pots, the midwife's hands, Pilar's songs, Leela's braids. The house had been a vessel for many hands. The letter read like a confirmation that the past's kinship had not been lost. The village, in its slow way, kept learning. People who had leaned into fear kept returning to help. The council that had once fretted over property values came, one by one, to volunteer small tasks. No one called the continued presence of the shelter a miracle in a way that would make it exotic. Instead, they called it neighborliness. They had, over time, built around the house a web of care that was both ordinary and holy. Mara's life concluded not in some solitary epiphany, but in a series of small farewells. She passed the diary to Leela with hands that shook. She left a note on the shelf where the photograph had been found. "Keep a candle for those who come hungry for more than bread." Leela put her fingers to the paper and nodded, the same motion that Mara had made years before when she first read the scrawled line and felt the house open beneath her feet. The flame kept burning. On her last night in the house, her body tired but her spirit collected, Mara sat with the photograph in her lap and the candle between both hands. She remembered the man in simple robes who had sat, the hush that had filled the rooms during storms, the small cardboard notes that testified to ordinary change. She breathed for a long time and said simply, in the voice of someone accustomed to asking for capacity rather than guarantees, "Lord, thank you for the people who kept coming. Forgive the things we did clumsily. Bless those who will come after. She rested her forehead against the old photo and felt, in the descent of breath, the sense that she had been part of something older than herself.
There was no dramatic procession. There were people who came to her bedside in quiet. Pilar, Lila, the midwife, Tomas with his wooden crafts, a man who never gave his name. They sat in the dim room, each bringing a small offering of presents. Someone read from the diary, another sang under their breath. In that company, Mara felt the measure of a life that had been neither great nor small by the world's reckoning, but faithful to the thing assigned to it. Keep the light, feed the hungry, sit with sorrow. Her last words were a small benediction. Keep the candle lit. After she was gone, the house continued, as it must. That is the thing about stewardship. It is designed to be passed on. Lila kept the guest book. Pilar tended the herb pot. The midwife wrote recipes at the back of the diary for those who would need to know how to make a child sleep. The ledger kept growing. The photograph remained on the windowsill, edges curled in the way a memory softens yet holds its face. Years later, someone from the next valley would come, drawn perhaps by rumor, perhaps by need, and sit at the same table. They would find, neatly written on the first page of the diary's newest section, words that any weary traveler might need. We keep a candle for those who come hungry for more than bread. You are welcome. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope. If you believe that God often reveals His presence in places the world discards, write "I believe" in the comments, and let that be a small public candle. Subscribe for more stories that point to how quiet faithfulness can change a life and a village. May the light you keep be enough for tonight, and may you have courage to keep it the next day. Well done.